Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 42 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Tampa Bay Lightning, which the Sharks have lost 7-1. A pretty embarrassing loss, though not necessarily unheard of. Teams all around the league will occasionally have the types of nights where they just don't seem to have anything going their way, and the other team seems to be getting some lucky bounces here, and generally is just playing better, and that's exactly what happened here tonight. The Sharks were, by all accounts, completely outmatched by the Tampa Bay Lightning. This is exactly why the Lightning were a team who have won the back-to-back Stanley Cups in 2020 and 2021. Meanwhile, the Sharks are the team that missed the playoffs in both of those years. And so, when it comes to this game, it's not necessarily surprised to see the Tampa Bay Lightning come out on top, though I guess the manner that it did happen ended up looking more embarrassing than the Sharks would have liked, because, like I mentioned earlier, the Lightning got some bounces, the Sharks didn't. We saw the Sharks, they scored a goal in this game that ended up getting called back. They hit multiple posts. There were about 5 or 6 scrambles in the crease with Brian Elliott, the Lightning goaltender, that somehow did not manage to go in. Hedman had to scoop one off the goal line or close to the goal line back into Elliott. There was a Noah Gregor one that goes in, but it was right after the whistle, even though the puck was still uncovered. So generally, the Sharks probably could have had many more than just the one goal here tonight, but in every case, I would say they probably lose this game anyway. And on the Lightning side, they did get a couple of bounces on that first goal from Colton. It deflects right off the stick of Vlasic. On the fourth goal from Corey Perry, it goes off of an official. But like I said, the Lightning probably would have won anyway. So generally, when you take a look at a game like this, kind of similar to the game a few weeks ago against the Pittsburgh Penguins, where the Sharks, they did end up clawing their way back into the game, though still lost 8-5. It's just one of those games that there really isn't much to say about. There really isn't much to analyze. I could technically go through every single one of these players and say, this guy didn't play well, that guy didn't play well. But it's kind of just generally accepted that the team had a bad night, and you kind of just have to move on from that. Not to say that that is an excuse for the Sharks playing bad, and you just say, well, who cares, you're going to have these types of nights. Obviously, you want to avoid these types of nights as much as possible, and the fact that the Sharks are having one here tonight against Tampa Bay, just a few weeks after they had another one against the Pittsburgh Penguins that I mentioned earlier, it's not a great look, but still, like I mentioned, it's something that does happen to every single team. I mean, just take a look at the Tampa Bay Lightning themselves. Just yesterday, they faced off against the Anaheim Ducks and got pretty much embarrassed themselves by a score of 5-1. Not the 7-1 margin that the Sharks had here tonight, but still a 5-1 loss that the Lightning certainly were not super happy with. And look how they managed to respond the next day and just trash the San Jose Sharks here tonight. And so when it comes to the goals here in this first period, the Sharks were way outmatched in that first period. The Lightning came out strong with a 4-0 lead. The Sharks would get one back from Megna, an unlikely suspect, to make it 4-1, but that would be the score at the end of the first period. Come second period, this was the good period for the San Jose Sharks. They looked decent enough. A team that if you watch the second period, you'd say, how are they down 4-1? Well, it's because the first and third were not particularly good, but even in a decent second period, they didn't manage to score a goal, and it would be the Lightning who would have the only goal of the middle frame from point to make it 5-1, and in the third period, the Lightning would put this game away very early on. Killorn, and then very soon after, Colton would score, and it's a 7-1 Lightning victory. On to the players to talk about. As I said, I'm not really going to mention many of them, but I'll mention a couple of them. I should also mention the lineup changes that Bob Booner had decided to go with here tonight. He wanted to try and spread the scoring around, since the Sharks had obviously been having a lot of trouble scoring, not just as of late, but for pretty much the entirety of this season. As such, Dahlin was moved up to the first line, and Barabanov was moved down to the second line. However, those lines did not last particularly long. Once the Sharks started falling behind 3-0, 4-0, Barabanov was immediately put back onto that first line with Hertl and Meyer to try and generate some sort of offensive chance, and I guess it technically worked, since while Megna's goal was assisted just by Ryan Merkley and nobody else in terms of forwards, it was this first line that was on the ice and managed to generate a lot of the good chances that the Sharks actually had here tonight. There was also the goal that I mentioned earlier that was called back. That was scored by Timo Meier on a distinct kicking motion. So once Barabanov was put back onto the first line, it looked okay, but that's about it. On the second line, it ended up actually being Gregor with Couture and Matt Nieto. Dahlen was moved down from the first line to the third line after the first 10-15 minutes, which was somewhat surprising. I guess Nieto looked okay in this particular role, but nothing extreme. Gregor came very close to getting a goal and finally breaking through, but like I also mentioned earlier, that was the goal that ended up not counting because the whistle had blown before the puck actually ended up going into the net. So a bit of a bad break there for Gregor. He almost had that goal finally, but it didn't end up happening. The third line ended up being Cogliano, Bonino, and Dahlen. Didn't really do much of anything, but the line that I do want to talk about was actually the fourth line of Weatherby, Raska, and Viel, which surprisingly was one of the better Sharks lines here tonight. I won't go so far as to say they were the best line. I still think the first line of Meyer, Hurdle, and Viel, Barabanov, took the cake for that one. However, the fourth line definitely was rather close and much closer than you would think. They actually had some pretty decent chances for themselves. Weatherby, one of his better games of the entire year. Viel looked pretty decent. Raska looked quite strong, so that was kind of nice to see. On the defensive side of things, obviously the defense is not going to look good ever in a game that you lost 7-1. Vlasic had many mistakes. Shemek had many mistakes. Burns had many mistakes. Megna had many mistakes. But if there is a player who I do want to talk about as usual, that would have to be Ryan Merkley, who I actually thought was going to end up having an expanded role here tonight because of the injury to Erik Karlsson. The Sharks were rolling with just Brent Burns as their main offensive guy, and I thought they'd kind of settle on to Ryan Merkley being their secondary offensive guy on the back end, but that did not actually end up happening. I have written here that Megna and Merkley were the second pairing, but that seemingly was not the case. Vlasic and Shemek as a duo were actually treated as the second pairing, and it was Merkley and Megna who were treated as the third, as Merkley didn't even reach the 13-minute mark here tonight, which was somewhat disappointing. Obviously, this was not a perfect game from Merkley, as you would expect against such a tough competition like the Tampa Bay Lightning. But I liked Merkley's game here tonight anyway. He had a nice assist on the Megna goal. We saw him actually make a misplay there at the blue line. I believe it was on the Braden Point goal where he ends up going for an aggressive pinch. It doesn't work out, but then he gets on his high horse. He forechecks back to try and defend, and it ends up being passed back to the to Braden Point in this situation, who is not covered by the back checker, and so it ends up being a goal. But I did like Merkley getting back into the play, racing back, and then his frustration, you could see it after the goal does let in, is also a pretty decent thing to see, just to show that he's absolutely engaged in what is happening in the game. And then just a few minutes later, we would see Ryan Merkley again go for an aggressive pinch at the blue line, not deterred by his previous failure a few minutes earlier, and this time it actually worked out and ended up being a decent chance on net for the Sharks and their fourth line with Merkley on the back end. So nice to see Merkley going for the bit more aggressive plays. This is exactly what I asked for at the end of in my previous review of the Seattle Kraken game. I was hoping that Ryan Merkley could go for a bit more offensive oomph to his game, because he had kind of calmed down his game, which was not really something that we expected to see from Ryan Merkley. So nice to see that he's making these aggressive plays. As I said, he had that nice pass on the Megna goal. So generally, not a fantastic night or anything like that, because the team still did get demolished, but okay enough. When it comes to the goaltending side of things, honestly, not really much to mention. Could Reimer and then Hill, consequently, after Reimer got pulled, could they have maybe had one or two of these goals? Yes. Would it have mattered? Not really. It's hard to really chastise the goaltenders in this type of situation. There are going to be games where, let's say, your team loses 5-1, where it's almost, a big part of the loss is on those goaltenders, but this night is not one of those nights. I really don't think that these two goalies who did play really had much to do with this one. It was just a general team failure. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday, where they will take on the Washington Capitals, a team they have played already this season and got shut out by. So, there's not really anywhere to go but up when it comes to a rematch with the Capitals. Class dismissed.